Hi, everyone. Hope you can hear me and see me just fine from wherever you're at. Jamie, Gabe, how we doing?
Great.
Hi,
Doing great.
All right. We're great. We are ready to kick this off. I just wanted to say thank you to all of you who are joining us. It's been really exciting to see your registrations come in over the last couple of weeks and to see how many of you are joining us from various locations across the US and a couple of other countries as well. My name is Shelly Benyon and I'm the General Manager for Hawkeye Industries. And we have worked with Common Fiber for years now, and we're so delighted to be able to be here with them and with you and talk a little bit about Sunshield. So we're going to just introduce ourselves, introduce Hawkeye a little bit. I'm joined by my colleague, Jody Wise. Jody, you want to say hello?
Hello, everyone. It's nice to see everybody here. And please don't hesitate to use the chat room and ask questions, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of things covered and you may not get every detail of what's going on. So please interact.
Absolutely. So we will be, like Jody mentioned, we will be monitoring the chat and making sure that we pull out as many questions as we possibly can. And we'll follow up with you guys at the end that if there are questions we don't get to or don't get answered, that we take care of those. So a little bit about Hawkeye Industries. Our Duratec line of products is what we're talking about tonight with our Sunshield 904061. Hawkeye was founded in the wonderful year of 1983, and we are the worldwide marketers for Duratec, Aquabuff, and Sterasafe. Our Duratec is manufactured here in Southern California, which is where Jody and I are physically located. Jody is our West Region Technical Sales Manager, so he kind of covers the entire Western United States. I'm centrally based, and we have Rob Smothers on the East Coast. We serve a variety of different industries, including automotive, carbon fiber automotive. So we've been through a lot of Sunshield over the years. As I mentioned, we'll be taking questions as we can throughout this and trying to answer them in a timely fashion as the presentation is going through, and then certainly coming back and trying to follow up on as many as possible. But I just want to remind you that Jody and I, as well as our entire team and the team at Common Fibers, are fantastic resources for this time that we're here together, and then also later as questions come up as you're using your sample of Sunshield in the coming weeks. We met, I don't remember when we met Gabe and Ann Mountjoy, who founded Common Fibers, but we met Gabe and Ann. Jody met them several years ago, but they met back in Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo. I believe, Gabe, and correct me if I'm wrong, you were on the concrete canoe team?
No, not concrete canoe, but the super mileage team.
Super mileage team. Okay,
Yeah,
well, that certainly makes more sense than concrete canoe.
Not quite a canoe, but building cars that go 2,000 miles per gallon all out of carbon fiber.
All out of carbon fiber. Well, and in addition to the project and the experiences that they had on campus, they found each other and certainly developed a passion for carbon fiber. And one of the things that I love that Gabe and Ann said when we were with them a couple of years ago is, and it is demonstrated here tonight, is their passion for open source sharing of information. Over the past several years, they've really developed carbon fiber work and really gotten into it and learned some of the tricks of the trade and learned from maybe some of you also on this call. So that is part of what brings us all together, is their willingness to talk about what they've done and what they've learned and then demonstrate it here for you guys. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Gabe and Jamie, who are there in Common Fibers in Seattle.
Awesome. Thank you, Shelly. Appreciate the intro. Yeah, once again, we're Common Fibers. Just to iterate back on what she was saying, the name is Common Fibers because our goal and mission has been from the beginning to make carbon fiber more common with open source information, unlike most sort of closed down composite companies we've seen. So we are here to help others learn. It's a rising tide in the composites community. So please feel free to reach out on our social media afterwards for any questions relating to Sunshield or any other composite process. We are here to help. So without further ado, let's jump into Sunshield. We are in our finish booth here. So this is a booth we spray only clear things in. So that would be Sunshield and acrylic urethane clear coat to finish parts. So we'll be spraying a bit, as well as showing some of the other processes that we do with Sunshield. And basically there's three uses of Sunshield that we use basically every day. First and foremost is that we use it for sealing edges of parts that are assemblies. So this is a wing end plate to a spoiler, and it's two pieces that come together. So we'll use Sunshield to seal the gap after they've been glued together to fully lock it together. Additional to that, we will coat parts that don't have anything on them, so just raw carbon parts. We will paint on or spray Sunshield onto them to give it a nice surface that we can then sand on. But really, the main use of it that we primarily do is in mold coating, in which we are pre-spraying our molds with Sunshield before we do our infusion or layup, so that our parts come out already with a nice clear primer that's ready to sand on if needed, and could basically be blocked and polished and sent off to a customer, or we can add additional coats of acrylic urethane for more UV protection. So as we get going, like Shelly said, please ask comments as I go. If we don't get the answer during the presentation, we'll open up at the end to try and get those questions answered. All right. So to start, we're going to look at edge sealing a part. Pretty straightforward and simple in that we're just going to want to mix up a little bit of Sunshield with a little bit of MEKP. I prefer 1.5%, considering the temperature, not wanting to kick off too fast on us. But basically, we're going to brush it into place. You can see we've already taped off the edges. Ideally, you do not want your Sunshield to get all over your part because it does dry very hard and it's difficult to remove and sand off afterwards. So I would paint it and let it cure for a while and then peel the tape off. So let's go ahead and mix that up. And at the same time, we will go ahead and paint onto an uncoated part. This is an arm guard for downhill skiers. And then following that, we will actually spray on to this part of the heart, actually, while we spray the mold. Okay, so to begin, we will mix a little bit up. I would suggest mixing it, it's already been stirred, but just to make sure you've got a nice mix before going. And get ourselves some board there. Going with 200 today. And some MEKP. You will see that when we spray it, we will thin it with acetone. But for a part like this, we want it actually to be basically as thick as possible. And I do know that Duratec, Hawkeye is coming out with a couple different viscosities of Sunshield, depending on your application. So something they can speak to a little more.
Thank you, Gabe. That's certainly something we've been in development with and has really kind of shifted the experience a lot of people are having depending on what their process and projects are.
Sure. All right. So now we're mixed up 1.5% MEKP in 200 milliliters. And just using a simple bristle brush, you can use a foam brush, but I've found foam brushes do break down just with chemicals. And tend to leave a more bubbly surface. So using a bristle brush is what we've determined we like. I do like to make sure there's no extra loose fibers in there. So peel those out first before you get going, and then always check your part afterwards to pull any loose fibers if you need to. So going ahead and painting some on. You just want a good solid coat. This is going to seal that edge. Cover up any glue that you may have used. We do recommend nice urethane, 2-part urethane glue. Something a little bit flexible, not quite as rigid as an epoxy for most applications. Still sands pretty nicely. But then you can just lay a nice thick layer onto here. You'll be able to sand it afterwards and smooth it out. But the goal is that you're left with no porosity on that seam. which is something you'll see pretty common on carbon parts, as they'll have defects along the seams where they haven't been sealed well enough. So
Gabe, one of the questions that we've had so far is about the dispenser that you've got on the top of that Sunshield can.
absolutely. Game changing if you do not have one. These are automatic paint mixers that you'll see. The brand on this one is Dido's. But I cannot recommend it more. It's got a sealed gasket on here. So you stick this on inside. It's got mixing blades, so you can mix it with a drill before you stir it. And it's got a sealing lid that opens up. So you don't have to make a mess. And as soon as I finish this can, I just throw it onto the other can and never have to clean it. So there's Dido's. Yeah, professional. They've got full systems of them where they'll mix 20 of these cans at the same time. We love it for Sunshield.
Thank you. That is pretty nifty.
All right.
So Gabe, as you're working through that, I'm going to answer or throw one more question out there for either you or Jody. Can you thin Sunshield with MEK?
I'll leave that to Jody, but
that's a Jody question. I know.
Yeah.
MEK or acetone can be used. There's differences between the two. Acetone evaporates extremely fast, and that's good and bad depending on exactly what you're trying to do. If you want it to level and flow better and you add acetone and you add a small amount of acetone, it will reduce the viscosity rapidly, but as you spray it, the acetone will evaporate off quickly. And once the acetone flashes off and it's on the part, it's not going to level and flow much better than it did prior to adding acetone to it. The only benefit is that it came out of the gun easier. And people tend to start adding more acetone so that there's extra acetone in the system, so that there's still surplus acetone when it's on the part, so it will level and flow. That kind of achieves what you want to do. But once you start adding too many solvents to it, you start messing with the chemistry a bit. And you don't want to, sometimes it's noticeable, sometimes it's not, but less is better. So if you add MEK, MEK evaporates slower. So if you're looking for a surface to level and flow a little bit better, MEK will evaporate slower, so you don't have to add as much of it to the mix, and it will stay in place a little longer before it flashes off. We're not talking about a lot of acetone or a lot of MEK, and there's no right or wrong number. You have to make sure that you're not adding too much. Now, I believe Gabe adds about 10% acetone.
That's correct.
And when he's spraying it, most of that is flashing off, and it makes it easier to use in an application in mold or in other situations. But MEK can be used. It's one of those things you kind of have to experiment with because every carbon part is different. Sometimes you're going to want to use it as is out of the can, and other times you may want to add something to it just to achieve a certain goal. And we can't tell you every combination of things depending on the fiber, depending on the resin base the part's made out of, depending on your spray equipment and your application procedures. It's going to vary. So we can't give you a hard and fast answer. Although on a data sheet, we may do it because we have to say something on the data sheet.
Thank you, Jody. Absolutely. So I've already sealed the edge on here. I'm going to move on to painting this arm guard. I want to note basically our prep process for these parts. We like to sand to 180 grit or 220 on the surface. Same width on our edge here before we paint it. Give it a good grip for the Sunshield to stick to. Otherwise, you could have adhesion issues. So this part, as I mentioned, a quick scuff is all it needs, and the Sunshield will stick very well. We'll paint some of this on here, and we should see it fill in porosity. This is a part that definitely has some porosity. It's a good candidate for getting a nice thick primer on it instead of spraying it directly with some acrylic urethane that's just way too thin. You will see some bubbles in here, but those will sort of off gas and disappear over time. We have, played with heating it a little, using a heat gun to eliminate some of them. But for the most part, we're using this as a primer, not as a finished surface. So we're going to sand this afterwards, and any little defects will come right out and be ready for our final coat, which would be typically sprayed instead of painted. Although you could finish this out with some good hand blocking and elbow grease, you can get yourself a finished part. I do want to make sure the edges are fully coated, and if I see any areas that keep popping back up and open, we can work it in a little bit. You can use a squeegee on a bigger part also if you got lots of porosity. And that porosity is somewhat inevitable if you're infusing a part, especially if you're doing just a wet layup, no vacuum. Even most pre-preg parts out of autoclave just don't have enough pressure. So you're going to have micro porosity. You might not be able to see it, but as soon as you start spraying or painting your part, you very often will see it, which is why Sunshield is such a game changer for us, is that it's so much thicker and fills it in so much better than a clear coat. That just, if I were to spray this part, I'd probably need to go through 3 or 4 rounds of spraying clear coat on it to get it to fill out and level. Versus with Sunshield, I can do 1 coat painted on or sprayed on, followed by 1 coat of acrylic urethane, and it's done and ready to ship. So really recommended for saving you time on the finish world. Okay, so that is painted. We'll let that dry. It's MEKP based, so it's going to take a couple hours. We could turn on the heat lamps in here to bake them a little faster if we wanted to. But this will be ready to sand in a couple hours, and we could go ahead and shoot it with some clear coat later today if needed. So really quick, really can speed up your process.
Gabe, just out of curiosity, do you feel like, not every application is going to be brushed, but do you feel like that eliminates some of the dry pinholes that you might typically see? Yeah, definitely brushing on it. If you have a part that is very porous, you can just skip straight to brushing it, or you can do a hybrid of the two in which you spray it on and then brush out any pinholes. Sunshield is so good at self-leveling that your brush strokes typically will disappear, but you can get most of your part nicely sprayed, and we might actually see that happen on this next part that we'll spray, that you'll see it start popping out with porosity, and instead of just leaving it, we'll come back through and brush it. The worst thing is leaving pinholes and porosity on your part after a round of Sunshield or clear coat. Your best bet is fill it in, brush it in, and sand it back down and spray it again if you need to, but leaving a bunch of pinholes really gets you nowhere. Yeah. Just one more kind of question on this, Gabe, if you don't mind. Go for it. You just referenced that you'll brush this on, then come back and spray. I'll spray first and then brush it if I'm seeing porosity. If you're seeing porosity, okay. And have you there done it from start to finish, brushing it? Yes, absolutely. Okay. And a brush can leave a different finish. How are you achieving what someone might refer to as a Class A finish? Do you have any tips for that with the brush? Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at this part that just got painted, it has some speckles in it, a little bit of air bubbles, and probably some dirt and grime in there. But it's been painted on, it's leveled itself out really nicely already. Once this cures, I could start sanding on it at 800 grit or so, and then step it up to 1500, and then compound and polish it. And this part would look like an A finish, no problem. So you really can with the brush achieve it. Just it's going to be slower, and it's not going to be quite as uniform, and you're going to end up working more and more sanding versus a spray on finish. Instead of starting at 800 grit, you can go ahead and jump straight to 15 or 1200 and move from there. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. Cool. So the next step and what we do more often is we'll be spraying it instead of brushing parts. We'll do the seams quite often, but you often can skip this step if you spray in mold. So you can see here we have one of our fiberglass molds,
These are some canards for a Mustang GT 500. There's 2 sets of canards in this mold if you're trying to figure out what you're looking at. But we will go ahead and spray directly onto the mold. So to do that, you're going to need to follow a pretty specific prep process in order to get good results. And I think that's where things break down often. And you might not have, if you've tried this before, you might not have had the best results because there are some particular things you need to follow. So to start, we will always want to prep the mold with wax. Partall #2 green paste wax is what we use. So on a fresh mold that's unseasoned, we'll do 4 coats and we use a 2-rag method. So you want to go ahead and wipe it, apply it with the applicator, and then wipe it off with 1 rag so you get the majority. Follow up with a clean rag to wipe off the rest of it, and just follow the Partall directions for coats. But we'll do 4 coats on a fresh mold, and then we'll just do 1 coat in between each pull. And that basically can get us through a production run. If you do see your parts starting to stick, go ahead and do another 4 coats just to freshen it up again. But we're using Partall paste because it's not quite as slippery as some of the Chemtrend or other releases that are too slippery for Sunshield to stick to. You actually want it to stick. Otherwise, you're going to see it beating up and not forming a nice uniform film over your part. So Partall we found forms the perfect amount of tackiness to do just that. All right. So once it's been waxed, we get into the paint booth here, and we will do 1 final clean off with a clean rag, lid-free rag to make sure there's no particles left, and then we will go ahead and blow it off with some clean air. That is one thing. If you aren't certain that the air going through your air lines is clean, we do not recommend blowing off your mold because you could be spraying oil onto it, which could cause adhesion issues as well. So definitely do be careful about that and just stick to a wipe off method unless you're comfortable with the air you're spraying. All right. So next thing we're going to do here is start mixing up some Sunshield for spraying, and then we'll turn on the booth fans. It's going to get loud in here for a little bit, and we'll walk you through spraying these parts. And at the same time, I will be spraying this harp neck part, very similar to what we just painted on, but I'll just be spraying it on. We'll see if it explodes with porosity and it needs to be brushed, or if we can build it slowly with Sunshield. So I do like the technique of multiple slow coats on a part to try and slowly fill in those porosity holes instead of just drenching it, in which very likely the surface tension is just going to split away from those pinholes. So low and slow is the method I like to say for painting most parts like this. The method for spraying a mold is that we like to do 1 dust coat on it, nice and light, give it something to tack and stick to, let that sit for about 2 minutes, and then follow that with 2 medium wet coats, making sure you get nice flow out and an even uniform surface. You've got a nice mold surface. There should not be porosity or pinholes. It really should be nice and uniform, and you'll be ready to move on to the next step after it cures. So I think unless there's any questions people have before getting going, we'll start mixing up some Sunshield and turn on the booth fans.
You guys can get going. We do have a couple of questions that have come in, Gabe, so I figure this will be a great chance for Jody and I to answer some of those questions as you get set up and start spraying. So Perfect. We do have some questions that have come in from you guys that are out there. If there are others, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and I'm doing my best to keep up with them. So one of the things that just came up with what Gabe was just talking about, Jody, and if this is a common question in our Duratec world, you will not be surprised by this. The compatibility of epoxy and Sunshield.
And we make several products in our lineup, from primers to clears to putties and things like that. Virtually all of the products that we take to market are epoxy compatible. They're both in mold compatible and post-applied compatible with epoxy. Now, there are some unique things you need to do with epoxy, because in a liquid state, the 2 chemistries are not compatible. So if you're applying epoxy over Sunshield in an in-mold part, you're gonna need to wait for the Sunshield to cure so it's tack-free before you apply your epoxy laminate to it. And just the opposite, if you've got a pre-preg part or some other epoxy part, it's going to need to be fully cured before you can apply Sunshield or any of the primers over it. And then you're going to have to sand the surface to make sure that, and clean the surface of the epoxy to make sure there's no amine on there and that it can get a good bite into that surface. So sanding with the most aggressive sandpaper that you can, whether that's 180 or, or 120 or 80 grit, just depends on the part and exactly what you're doing. The coarser the sandpaper, the better the bond. So that's what you have to look for. And when we're looking for a good bond, marine applications are the conditions that stress the bond the most. Other applications, especially interiors and some cosmetic parts, it doesn't stress the bond that much, and probably 90% of our customers, when they're using it, don't go to 80 grit. They're using 180 or something like that. But if you're putting us on the hull of a boat that's going to be in the water for the next 10 years, you want the best bond you can get.
Yes.
So that's why sometimes we're discussing 80 grit instead of 180.
And I think that's also a point to make, that for those of you attendees that go and look at our data sheets, and this was also brought up in the chat, that the data sheet might reference a specific grit. And the reality is, you may talk to Jody, you may talk to myself, you may talk to Gabe or Ann or Jamie, and they may say something slightly different. And part of that is because a data sheet requires some information and a general guideline, but your application might be able to tolerate something slightly different. So.
Well put. I'm getting pretty close here, and wanted to go ahead and run through the gun settings for people who are going to be spraying. Really, any old gun will work. Pick up a Harbor Freight gun, 1.4 to 1.8 nozzle, even larger is fine. But the main keys to how we spray it, this is a 1.4 Iwata, great for spraying clear coat, works also great for spraying Sunshield, so long as it's thinned out with a little bit of acetone, at 10% we talked about, or MEK. But high pressure, as opposed to when you're spraying clear coat, which you want to be spraying around 20 PSI, we'll crank this up to 40 or 50 PSI to really help atomize it, to get into really fine particles. That is critical. And then you'll just want to adjust your flow so you're getting enough material out, and it's, once again, really well atomized. You're not seeing speckles, but actually nice fine particle mist across your part. And that will be your first dust coat, and then we'll back it up a little bit more for those wet coats to make sure we're laying out enough material to build a full film. And same with the fan, just make sure you're kind of in a mid-range fan, not too pointed, but we will switch settings depending on while we're spraying. If we need to get into a nice tight crack in a part, we will adjust it in to a straight shot and step back and fire into those smaller areas. So I'll be sure to show some of that while I am spraying here in a little bit. And I did want to add to what Jody was talking about, the whole compatibility with epoxy. That is a huge thing to make sure you are working with. Epoxy definitely, it must fully cure. And what we've done is taken it a step further, working with Jody and these guys, is we Scotch-Brite and abrade the surface of that Sunshield after it is fully cured to also give it an additional keyed mechanical bond. So I could not recommend that more for getting good adhesion to your parts. Use the Scotch-Brite, and then you'll want to clean off any dust before you do your infusion. We use distilled water and a nice, really clean rag. You can also use some degreaser, but you do want to be careful with what other solvents and chemicals you're introducing when you're cleaning off that dust. Again, you can hose it off gently with your airline, but be careful also if you have oil in those lines. That's going to cause an adhesion issue once you do your infusion. So I do know that some like vinyl esters do adhere a lot better even, so you can skip some of these steps if you're using a different resin system. But we use epoxy only and the Scotch-Brite method to get a good adhesion. And it is pretty apparent if you didn't get a good adhesion. You'll notice it right away after your infusion. We post cure and bake our parts, so you'll see pretty fast if you did not get a good enough abrasion or something went wrong. that you'll kind of see a whiteness underneath the Sunshield where it is not fully stuck. And that's not always necessarily because of the Sunshield, but it's an indicator of a poor infusion or too much spray adhesive was used during the infusion. So there's a number of other reasons that can cause the adhesion to fail, but definitely do what you can to make it stick at the beginning with some Scotch Brite. Okay.
And to add to that a little bit, the epoxy doesn't wet out the carbon fiber nearly as well as a polyester or a vinyl ester does. And the carbon, the fibers are so fine and the bundles are packed together so tightly that it's very difficult for epoxy to wet everything out on the surface. So you may not get a good resin flow through to the Sunshield to wet it out completely so you get a good bond. So if you see some of those white areas in there, or they may not show up immediately, but they show up shortly afterwards, usually it's the epoxy did not come into full contact with the surface or well enough to form a good bond.
Absolutely correct. And one way we will address that, using a 3K or 6K instead of a 12K, sort of the fewer fibers in the bundle, the easier it is to wet out. So just making sure you're not using something too heavy and thick on that first ply and making sure you're getting enough resin flow to it. But absolutely, you need to have those bundles all wet out for it to get good adhesion. All right. We're ready to go ahead and mix up. Once again, we'll mute ourselves because you'll have a pretty loud fan noise going in here. Jamie will follow around and get up close and personal here so you can see how I'm spraying, and then we can answer questions afterwards. And of course, Jody and Shelly can continue answering questions as I spray.
Thank you, guys. Have fun. All right. So a couple of things I just wanted to mention. We're going to show a few slides and the progression of their work as we kind of watch them and then go back and forth. This webinar is being recorded. So all of the great advice that you're getting from Gabe, from Jody, it's going to be available to you after, which includes all of those slides as well, so that you can come back to those and reference those. So just keep that in mind. I wanted to just take us a step back to the spray gun setup. We got this question before from Jason as well, Jody. Just what is the ideal spray gun setup? And Gabe talked about it, but will you just...
You can go down to Harbor Freight and buy their standard gun, and it will spray our product good enough for 90% of what goes on. Our products are not that affected by the quality of the gun. Tip size more than gun quality. So if you're spraying a small part and you're doing in mold, you want a small tip, and the acetone really helps. What you want is a very, very small particle to land on the mold. We're talking hairspray, not house painting here. We want this just a very fine application, and that acetone evaporates off and leaves this small sticky particle on the surface that creates an excellent bed for the next layers. That's what you're trying to achieve. So if your stuff is moving, if you're spraying a complete film on the surface on your first pass, you'll probably end up with some fish eyes. So the critical step is a small enough tip so you can atomize it to a very small particle size and get an even distribution. Sometimes you don't even want to see it on the surface. Almost, you spray it on there and did any come out of the gun? That's enough.
Yeah.
Do that a couple of times.
This is a fine mist coat. So we can see Gabe there getting his spray gun all set up. Allison, will you go ahead and just pop on the first set of slides for us, and we'll take a peek at those and then come back to Gabe. So Gabe's going to move through steps 1 and steps 2. Step 1 was done beforehand, and you can see him, maybe if you joined the seminar a couple of minutes early, he was just checking on the mold surface before they got started, and he was wiping the mold clean with a rag. We can't tell you how many conversations we have with folks that have used whatever rag they can find and then wiped their mold surface and found some contaminants have made the process a little bit challenging. So make sure that your mold is kept in a clean area once it's been waxed, and that you clean the surface off before you spray. Before I go to step 2, Jody, one of the questions that came in through the chat was, and this is a common question, but when we're talking about mold prep, wax, what semi-perm, what can be used on the mold surface?
We recommend a silicone-free carnauba type wax for the most part, and the green wax, the Pardal paste works great for that. The reason is some of the semi-permanent mold releases, the polymer coatings are just too slick. There's nothing for the product to hang on to. If you're spraying something like gel coat that has a much higher viscosity and is much harder to spray and doesn't level and flow like Sunshield does, you can get away with that lack of surface tension just because you're putting so much material on. But one of the advantages of Sunshield, it doesn't need to be sprayed as thick and it's lower viscosity, so you can use a lot less of it, which is critical on weight sensitive parts. So, but to do that, you need to use the right kind of wax and apply it correctly, because there's no generic way to apply a wax. If you decide not to use the green wax and you're using some other wax, read the can, because even if you're using one of the common brands of waxes, they may have 4 different types of wax, and each one will call out for different procedures on the can as to how to use it.
Yeah.
And follow those procedures.
Yeah. What about PVA, Jody?
PVA works. Sometimes you have more problems trying to spray PVA than you do Sunshield, but it will work. There's no problem with it. If you can get the PVA to lay down and achieve a good surface with it, it will work.
Thank you for that question, Tim. All right, so we can see Gabe working through that first mist coat. Looks like he's adjusting. Oh, he's headed for the harp.
Yep.
All right. So while we are watching him spray that piece, Jody, one of the other questions that came in, going back to the spray gun, what about a dump gun?
Depending on the part you're doing, a dump gun could work, but it probably wouldn't work very well for an in-mold coating, only because there's no real control other than tip size. It's just coming out at whatever speed that it decides to come out at, and it's harder to manipulate the fan to get it in the right shape and the right particle size. Not that you can't do it, but it's going to take some experimentation to get a tip small enough on a dump gun to make it work. Now, if you're post applying it on a surface, sometimes extra material, and that's one of the things I was going to say, post applying it, you're going to want more material being applied to the surface sometimes. If you've got an easy to spray part, you may want to flood that surface with Sunshield, because you will get an excellent finish. If you start out with too fine of a fan on an easy to spray surface, sometimes it's a little harder to get it to all fill in. You want the final coats to be kind of a flood coat, and it will self-level and eliminate a great deal of the texture. So, if you're doing a flat tabletop, whereas a lot of people make things like large tabletops, you can basically flood the surface with Sunshield and it will come out looking like glass. So that is one option. Again, on our data sheet, it may say something slightly different because we have to give generic information that will work for most people. And in this situation, there's specifics as to what you can do.
Yeah.
And you may or may not want to add any reducer to it of some type.
Yes.
It just depends on the exact situation.
Well, and that's one of the things that we love the most about working with each of you that are out there. Several of you I know are folks that we have talked to or been in your shops. And just like Common Fibers, we learn from what you've tried and succeeded at in your shop that might kind of inform us for something else.
Now, I don't want to
Yeah,
interrupt here, but
talk.
what he's doing right now, he sprayed a somewhat thick coat on there, looked for the defects to see how many defects there were on this part, because there will be defects on every part, but it's going to vary quite a bit from part to part as to how many you see. So he sprays it, gets an idea of what's there, sprays enough on so that when he brushes it, it fills 90% of everything. And I should say that when he'll come back and brush those bad spots or spots where there's pinholes or porosity, you can see him doing that now. When he comes back and sprays over that, it will level and flow, and there's a 90% chance you'll never see those brush marks.
Yeah.
So you may have a finished part that looks beautiful, even though you used a brush and spray technique.
So on the process slide that was on the screen before, and again, you'll see it again, you can check it out in the webinar. It walks through the steps that Gabe is taking here in terms of a dust coat, medium coats, heavy coats. And he's got it here. Thanks for popping that in, Allison. He's got the light mist coat, the medium coat, medium wet coat, again, flash 2 minutes. One of the questions that came up in the chat, and I'm so sorry that I didn't write down whose name asked it, but thank you for the question, is how many coats do you need to put on here? And that's such a fantastic question. So Jody, how many coats?
You can pile it on 20 mils thick if you want and sand it and polish it, and it's good to go. Weight sensitive parts, they only may spray 7 mils down because it doesn't need to be any thicker than that. In mold, same thing. But you have to remember, if you're going to be sanding on this part, if there's defects in the finish, you're going to have to sand or spray a little bit more onto that surface so you can sand it and not go through. Now, if you sand it and go through, it's no big thing because you can just reapply more. It's a hassle, but the part can still look, like a Class A finish. You haven't destroyed anything by having to do it again if you mess it up the first time. It's just that you want to try and spray enough on there so that when you sand it, you don't go through. Yeah. If you have a perfect mold or an excellent surface to spray it onto, you may not need to sand it at all, depending on what you want to do.
Yeah. Thank you. Hey, Gabe.
Hello. You see all that?
We did. Look great.
All right. Yeah, so everything went as it should have. I hope you saw pretty clearly on the uncoated part. It started to show porosity across its surface. A couple quick brushes and a couple additional sprays totally leveled it out, and it's ready to go. We could go ahead and sand and polish this tomorrow and ship it out the door and get an A-class finish on it. So pretty awesome. And then clearly the mold laid out really well. Just 2 wet coats on it. One thing I do like to encourage people is not to use too much. Less is more in this instance. That if you build too thick of a coat, this is a polyester-based material. It shrinks as it cures. The thicker it is, the sort of yellowish, amberish hue, as you can see it in the cup, it can start to take on. And really, all you want is a fine film that's going to block any porosity and give you a nice base coat to spray another finish coat on, or something you can sand on a little bit. But our process, because we typically will finish with another coat of either Sunshield or acrylic urethane, is stay really thin on this film and don't overdo it. Highly recommended. Okay. Were there any other questions that came up while I was spraying that you haven't already answered?
So there's a few, some of them are just general questions. I think this is a good one for the 3 of us to talk through. And it was a question, let me go back and see if I can find the name of who asked us. But I know Keith mentioned it, and I believe somebody else mentioned it. Catalyst ratio. So
Absolutely.
Our general recommendation is kind of this standard static 2% by weight. You mentioned earlier 1.5. There's definitely a reason why you're using that amount. So can we kind of talk through the catalyst piece together?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we adjust based on the season and the temperatures within our booth. For us with a heated booth, we are able to spray definitely the lower percentage, 1.5%, and then bake it, turn on our lights or turn on the heated air, and get parts to kick off pretty fast, or we'll preheat the booth so that we're spraying 80-degree, even up to 90-degree temperatures if we want to. And so we like to just keep it low. The worst thing you can do for your gun is let that kick off. I already went and cleaned my gun afterwards, and do not want to leave it sitting in there because Sunshield dries to such a hard surface when it's done. That gun is not salvageable afterwards, like a clear coat that's pretty soft, really. So that's why we go with 1.5%. It's a little safer on a production environment side of things. There's less room for error. If someone were to put too much in, you have a real problem with it kicking off too fast.
And on our end, why on our data sheet it says 2% is because customers always like to cheat on the low end of catalyst. So,
Or get creative.
like Gabe, we say 2%, he puts in 1.5. 1.5 is safe, but if we said 1.5,
Yeah.
there would be people putting in 1%.
Sure.
Get below 1.5, and I won't tell you what the real number is, but we say 1.5 because you may not get a complete cure before that. You start losing the physical properties, and weathering is one of the properties that you may begin to lose. The same thing happens if you add too much catalyst. If you go over 2%, it starts adding color to more color to it. So you see in the container he's got there, it kind of has an amber brownish greenish look to it. When you're looking through an inch or two of it in the container, or from the side 4 inches of it, it looks like it's got a lot of color to it. But at 7 to 10 mils thick in a fine thin layer, it looks clear. It doesn't add any color to it. But if you put it on 30 mils thick, you're going to see that color. Start to see
Absolutely.
it.
Okay, so a couple of other questions. Do we have a minute, Gabe? We good?
Yeah, for it.
Okay, so a couple of other questions. One is for our side, which is what is the shelf life of Sunshield? That's an easy question. It is 6 months in terms of warranted shelf life. And that's at room temperature if we're talking about 65-degree standard warehouse, standard shop, not temperature controlled necessarily. So maybe you're seeing a fluctuation up into the 70s. We have kind of, again, like the comment on grit for sanding or catalyst, the 6 month shelf life is not an expiration. It's a best buy. We have customers who use our material beyond the 6 month shelf life. We have customers who will refrigerate their products and slow down that acceleration process and use it many, many months later. The 6 months is our standard. This is what to expect from it. One other question that I'm seeing here, what is the upper limit of cured Sunshield?
Upper limit of it in terms of
Limit, I'm gonna guess, and David, for high temp parts and coating. So it's a polyester base, like Gabe mentioned before. Generally, we're looking at about 180 to 200 degrees Fahrenheit.
What you're going to see is if you heat it up too much, is it's going to start to change color. So it can take some higher temperatures, but it's going to start to change color. And the thicker you spray it on the part, and if you take it to those temperatures, the more color change you're going to see.
Yeah, absolutely. We post cure our parts at 180 degrees, and so that has a Sunshield on it, and that's just fine. But definitely, if it gets too close to an element within the oven, you can start to see those effects, and so you definitely want to be careful of that.
Okay, another question we got from Ro, can we add pigment to Sunshield? We get this question a lot, and there are some people doing some fantastic work out there with Sunshield and flake, Sunshield and pigment. Pigment can be tricky. Jody, you want to talk about pigment for a second?
Yeah, not all pigments are created equal, so you have to experiment a little bit where you get your pigment and what it's like, how it reacts in the product. But you can tint it to a translucent color. That's not a problem. You can add pearlescence to it to get that effect. It's very forgiving of what you add to it. Now, if you're adding flake or metallic or some other type of material to it, you got to be able to spray it through the gun. It has to come out through the tip. And if you're putting any of those in it, if you're doing it in mold, you want to put a clear down for a layer with nothing in it first, and then your pigmented layer or your layer with something in. I shouldn't always say pigmented because it works okay with pigment if you just spray one coat. But if you're putting metallic in it or flake or something else, make sure that there's a clear in the mold first, a very, very thin layer, or a clear over the top of it after the fact, because you can't work on those surfaces and make it look right again at all unless there's a clear on the surface. So you have a defect in the part, you can't make a metallic look right again unless you have to have some clear on the surface to sand and polish on if that's what you're going to need to do. And if you sand through that clear surface layer, good luck, because you may not be able to make it look right again.
Very well put, Jody. All right. We good to continue on, or any other questions we can get?
Go right ahead.
All right, perfect. So what you just saw with the in mold coating really is the start to every day here at Common Fibers. You know, we pull parts in the morning from the day before, get those molds prepped, waxed again, and into the booth as fast as we can. You'll notice we have tacky tape already laid around them and a layer of Scott or just a tape on top of that to protect it. So you're not getting your tacky tape messy, and we'll leave that tape on through the whole layup until we're ready to bag it. But this is the start to the process. So this is going to cure for a couple hours until it is hard to the touch. We'll go ahead and Scotch Brite it like we discussed, and then do our layup and infuse our part. We use epoxy once again, and that's going to have to sit and cure overnight to the next morning when it can be demolded and start the process again. But from there, you know, we take those parts and we will trim them to shape. If they're an assembly, of course, we'll glue them together like we did with these end plates, do any edge sealing. But at that point, after it's trimmed, you can have yourself a finished part. If you have a nicely polished, shiny mold, your part can be done right then and there. If your mold isn't perfect, you have some defects, you can go ahead and start finishing your part. You can sand just like it were a clear coat. And so I want to show, here is a part that is just a Sunshield finish that has been wet sanded 1500 grit and polished with some compound wool pads and some foam pads to get to a finished product that many customers are happy with. You know, Jody and team can comment on the UV stability of Sunshield, as well as in terms of its longevity, but it's going to last you a good while. And only if you really want to take it another step beyond this, would we go ahead and start prepping it for acrylic urethane, and which we will do for the majority of our parts, especially those that are a main body panel exterior on the car that's going to see a lot of sunlight when it's a car going to somewhere where there's sun, unlike Seattle. So you can see here, this is a hood for a Tesla Roadster. The original Tesla Roadsters, we create this hood, including the carbon frame underneath, out of carbon fiber. And this is a finished product that we have now. Started with Sunshield, sanded it, prepped it with 400 grit to then spray with an additional coat of clear coat. And ideally we can get it done with one more coat before we're ready to buff and polish. Sometimes, depending on the quality, we'll do an additional 2 rounds of spraying and sanding in between to get a real full concourse grade depth finish on it. So Jamie, if you want to peek around at these parts anymore, this is the finish you can get using Sunshield alone, and then Sunshield with additional clear coat on top.
And as Gabe said, not every customer uses a clear coat over the top of it. Some just use Sunshield as the finish, some put a clear coat over it. We don't emphasize either way because some people like the added insurance of adding a clear coat over the top. They sleep better at night doing that. And if that's what the customer is expecting, that's what they do. It works fantastically. If you're maybe making a part that is more cost conscious, it's not bad to use Sunshield alone. At a later date, if the surface starts to oxidize or discolor, I don't want to say discolor, the surface can discolor from the oxidation. It may turn a little bit white and chalky. And this is long-term, sitting in the sun with no care to it, no waxing, no polishing. Even if it does happen to get that way, if you take a buffer to it, it will look new again.
Mhm.
And most of the carbon fiber parts, people pay more attention to them and want to keep it looking good. So they're constantly waxing it, polishing it, maybe keeping it in the garage. So the weathering of the product isn't nearly as critical as what happens to the third car in the family that sits in the driveway and nobody ever pays attention to it, and the bicycles get leaned against it and everything else. That's not usually the market where these products are being sold to. So the care that gets taken of them, whether it's Sunshield alone or with a clear coat, there's no right or wrong answer to that. That's for you to decide.
Absolutely. Well, that is all I have to share. Once again, we're Common Fibers. We're based in Seattle. We are US made production composite parts, ranging from, consumer goods to automotive parts. We're vertically integrated, so we do all of our own tooling in-house and all the way through the finished process. So we do everything in one facility. Thank you for joining us. I'm glad to answer any more questions and open it up. But if you have other questions that you think of later, definitely reach out to us on social media. We're here to help.
I think, perhaps the last question, and again, you guys have been so fantastic to send your questions in through the chat and your comments, and just there've been some fun chat lines just about people who have met Jody along the way or who have worked with us or you guys at Common Fibers at some point. So it's been really fun to see those. We may not have hit on all of the questions, and if we missed one, if I missed one, I'm so sorry. Just reach out and talk to us. But perhaps the last piece we can, or the last question, and this kind of came in different ways that we can answer or address, is, Gabe, you talked a lot about the Sunshield finish, the Sunshield to automotive coating finish, urethane finish. If someone's looking for a Class A and they pull the Sunshield from the mold, and I know Class A can mean different things to different folks, but if they pull, if they're starting with just Sunshield, how do we work that into a spectacular finish?
If they're just working with Sunshield, you said?
Let's just start with just working with Sunshield. Yep.
Absolutely. I mean, it comes down to the quality of your mold. Ideally, if you polish your mold, you wet sand it to 1500, polish it. The parts that you pull out of that mold are going to mirror that surface finish. So the only risks you have and the difficulties in using an in-mold finish is the post-processing, that when you're trimming this part, you don't go ahead and scratch the surface and have to do some final finish to it. So if you're careful, you have a really nice mold, you can pull the part, trim it, and it's ready to go with an A-class finish if you finished your mold with an A-class finish. If there are any defects in it, which for an A-class finish, truthfully, there most likely will be, then you will need to go ahead and do some post work on that Sunshield, and you can treat it just like you're working on clear coat. Go ahead and sand it with as high of a grit as possible until you're happy with how flat and level it is, and then compound it and use your regular, whether it's 3M or Rio's Garage compounds to finish it off.
Anything different you would add, Jody?
No, that's exactly right. If your mold is in excellent shape, you will get an excellent finish. It's just going to mirror that surface. But the nice thing about it is it's easy to fix if you did drop your trim tool on the part and while it was running and it skims across the surface.
No one ever does that.
You can fix it. Once you stop crying, you can fix it.
Yeah.
So that's one of the nice things about it. It's very difficult to mess the part up to where you can't salvage it. And we're pretty candid, as you can notice in our answers, we're fairly candid in real world, not just what works in the lab or legal speak on what it is. In the real world, there's all kinds of solutions and all types of desired outcomes. And we're pretty familiar with what can go wrong and how you can fix it and what you may need for the exact application. So yeah, there's a solution for everybody. And that's why we're readily available for people to talk to with their own unique conditions of what it is they want to spray and what it is they want to do with it. Now, another application that Gabe doesn't really get into unless he's been keeping secrets, but we use this same product in swimming pools and hot tubs.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how durable it is as far as longevity. I've had samples of this in my hot tub now for 3 or 4 years, and they're fine. Yeah, I've scratched them up. They, that sort of thing. They're just bouncing around in the bottom of the hot tub, and I pick them up and look at them periodically to see how they're surviving. This isn't lab, this is real world. And the samples that I make to hand out to people are sprayed in my shop, not a lab.
Yeah.
And I do it one-off. If I make mistakes, I point out what the mistakes are. Look, there's some dust in it. It's going to happen to you. There will be dust in it. You will drag your hose through it. Your dust mask, your respirator will drip on the surface. A fly will land in it. All of these things happen, and there's no way to get around it, and you will survive. We can get you through the process.
Absolutely. Absolutely. All right. Well, Allison, if you will pop that last slide up there for us. You guys have just been fantastic guests and attendees. Please do not forget to check out Common Fiber's website if you haven't done so already. And there is a discount code for their carbon fiber wallets, which is how Gabe and Ann started with that fantastic hinge that they developed. So please go check them out. I meant to ask Gabe and Jamie, would you be able to post, since it's kind of hard to see, would you be able to post somewhere, social media or something, a picture of the Sunshield finished part and the automotive finished part?
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. So go check out their website. You will be getting an email from the Hawkeye team just with a quick follow-up, mostly so that we can make sure we have your address on file so we can send you your quart of Sunshield to play around with. So watch for that email to come from our team. And then please feel free, Allison, our fantastic marketing person who's been behind the scenes here, has our contact information up there for both Common Fibers and us here at Hawkeye. Please reach out to us. We love talking to you. We love what you're doing in your shops. Thank you all. Thank you, Gabe. Thank you, Jamie, behind the camera.
Thank you guys. It's been fun.
Yes.
Great night.
Thank
You.
you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
All right. Good
See you
night.
next time.